had the African discussion. What does it mean?
Good evening and welcome to this first public program of the Caribbean Global Thought in a few years, in public, in person. I'm Vishaka Desai, Chair of the Caribbean Global Thought, and it's a great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to this program, Reimagining Global, our extreme crises, the only way forward. Many of you know Caribbean Global Thought, but some may not. So just a word to say that Caribbean Global Thought, or CGT, as we affectionately call ourselves, is a presidential initiative founded or established by President Bollinger a long time ago. 2006 seems like a different world, when there was a feeling that the way the pace of globalization was going, we needed to have new concepts, new ways of thinking, and how to think about this world that was increasingly more globalized, more interdependent. And here we are, more than 10 years out, and the world seems very, very different. It is fair to say that since those early days, Caribbean Global Thought now is a flourishing program with a master's in global thought. Some of our students are here, welcome. Undergraduate initiatives, some of you are here, welcome. And faculty that actually gets together to think about how we imagine global to be. And I'm really thrilled that for this program, we have some of our faculty members and friends of Caribbean Global Thought who are on this panel to help us think about this issue. Why this issue now? I think it's really important to recognize that from 2006 to now, the world seems like a very different place. And that the world today seems more turbulent, more polarized, and more at risk than it has been in decades. One might even say that there's not a day goes by that you don't hear about globalization is dead, or it's in life support, or it is not going anywhere, or other people who would argue that actually globalization is just changing face and it is coming to be in a different place. We purposely didn't use the word globalization in the title, but the word global, because there is some difference in terms of the globalization that has been so much taken over by economic, political kind of conditions, whereas the word global seems to be more about both a concept of the world and a place or a space in which various issues and ideas get articulated. So the optimistic scenario that may have been thought of in the early days of globalization has definitely given over to more of a pessimistic world. The world feels more tribal, and especially after the crisis we have gone through, whether it's COVID or the emerging and ongoing climate crisis or the wars, not to speak of just Ukraine, but other parts of the world, that it does make us feel that we should be thinking about the concept of global today, or rethinking that concept. So what do we need to do to create a more collective vision of the world? Partly because as much as the world is polarized, as much as the world is divided, guess what? Every single crisis that we name actually has something about going beyond nation state, and yet nation state is part and parcel of where we are. So how do we think about solving the problems, if at all, or rethinking the problems in a global context? I am absolutely delighted that this particular conversation involves some of the most distinguished scholars right here at Columbia, committed to thinking about the world in a different way. And so this conversation is really an attempt by CGT to articulate the reality of global forms, trends, and processes in our current age, and to envision what a new global for the betterment of humanity or humankind may look like. So it's really a beginning of a series of dialogues that we hope to continue. Stay tuned for the next iteration of these issues. It will be thematic as well as site specific. So if you want to know more, always pay attention to the CGT newsletter, which is on weekly basis, but you will hear more from us as we go forward. So what we're going to do, and let me just introduce the panelists first, that it will be a conversation set and framed by my colleague, Professor Manan Ahmed, in a brief way, because it was his idea. So we wanted to make sure that we give him that platform. And then have a conversation among us. So no more big straight presentations. And I also should apologize that Professor Saskia Sasson, who we had hoped to join us due to unforeseen health circumstances, she's not able to join us. But a quick word on our panelists. So Professor Manan Ahmed, and I'm going to do very brief introductions because otherwise it'll take up the whole time. So Professor Manan Ahmed is an associate professor here at Columbia, and he's a historian of South Asia and the literal Western Indian Ocean world from 1000 to 18 CE. His areas of specialization include critical philosophy of history, colonial and anti-colonial thought, and he's also interested in modern and pre-modern historical narratives and how they create understanding of places, communities, and intellectual genealogies for their readers. Next to Professor Ahmed is Professor Jean-Marie Guilléno, and he's the Arnold A. Salzman Professor of Practice in International and Public Affairs and the director of SIPA's Kent Global Leadership Program on Conflict Resolution and director of International Conflict Resolution Specialization. His interest in terms of research and publications are in the area of impact of globalization on strategy, globalization and the international system, and also the end of nation state, which is one of his books that he had done earlier. Next to Professor Guilléno is Yasmin Ergez. And Professor Ergez is a director of the specialization on gender and public policy and senior lecturer in discipline in international and public affairs. Her recent work has focused on the emergence of international market in reproductive services, the transformation of motherhood, in quotes, as she puts it, and the impacts of human rights programs and policies. And her work is also centered on feminist movements and their interactions with public policies and the implications of the concept of gender in and for feminist politics. Professor Mamadou Diaf is the Leitner Family Professor of African Studies and the Director of Columbia University's of Institute for African Studies. His research interests include urban, political, social, and intellectual history in colonial and post-colonial Africa. One of the things I should say about Professor Diaf is that he's also always conceptually thinking about not just Africa, but Africa's place in the world, and the concept of the universal is one of his preoccupations right now that I'm delighted to learn more about. And last but not the least is Dean Linda Fried. She is the Dean of Columbia University's of Mailman School of Public Health, and she has dedicated her career to the science of healthy aging and creating a health span that matches our increased life expectancy, prevention of frailty, disability, and cardiovascular disease, and defining how to transition to a world where greater longevity benefits people of all ages. And she has recently worked on a big global task force on healthy aging. Her interest is also, of course, in all public health issues and public systems, including things like COVID. So we're delighted to have Dean Fried with us as well. And I should say that all deans have many, many hats to wear. And today, she actually has to go to a fundraising dinner at the president's house. So if she leaves a little early, it's only because she has no choice. There's other people awaiting her. So I'm just delighted that you could join us for today. And what I'm going to do is to ask Professor Ahmed to say a few framing words, and then we'll go right into the conversation. Thank you.
So I can do this here. I'm grateful to Professor Vishaka Desai and Beth Smea and the Committee on Global Thought for this opportunity to have an important conversation with such renowned experts as have gathered today. My task, as I see it, is to lay out as briefly as possible the prompt for the evening. I want to start by taking a moment, however, to remember the activist, scholar, historian, urbanologist, and seer, Mike Davis, who passed away yesterday. In Davis's work, starting with City of Quartz, Excavating the Future in Los Angeles, 1990, Late Victorian Holocaust, El Nino famines and the Making of Third World, 2001, Planet of Slums, Urban Involution, and the Informal Working Class, 2006, and other volumes, we see both a clear-eyed examination of the various crises that surround us, but also a refusal to speak only from the perspective of the crisis. Davis in City of Quartz asks us to pay attention to a conjuncture, a moment ripe with paradox. This is his quote, a moment ripe with paradox and non-linearity when previously separate currents of history suddenly converge with profoundly unpredictable results. Another seer, prophet, that bears an invocation this evening is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, also from California. Gilmore, who has focused her attention to the project of carceral geographies and anti-carceral and abolitionist futures, also combines, like Davis, a critique of the crisis as an explanatory language for coercive, expansionist, and extractive politics. In Golden Gulag, Prisons, Surplus, Crisis, and Opposition in Globalizing California, 2007, Gilmore reminds us that, quote, crisis means instability that can be fixed only through radical measures. She takes the definition of crisis from Stuart Hall, that, quote, crisis occurs when the social formation can no longer be reproduced on the basis of the pre-existing system of social relations, end quote. Both Davis and Gilmore, from their base in California, which, by the way, now is the 5th largest economy in the world, take a long list of crises that have unfolded in the United States that have shaped their global thought. The agrarian and debt crises of the 1970s, the housing and urban development crises of the 1980s, financial market crises of the 1990s, which gave rise to carceral, developmental, neoliberal, neocolonial, and military politics of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. From that vantage point, they connect the fortress LA to West Bank, the prison industrial complex in US to carceral politics in Latin America, Philippines, or India. In the last decade alone, we can add the global pandemic, mass displacement, the so-called refugee crisis, and the environmental crisis to those ongoing lists. Yet the currents of history have remained depressingly uniform. Our collective response are the return, at this moment, of fascism, techno-fascism, surveillance and racial capitalism, militarization, borderization of the urban spaces, and of course, outright war. And thus, at this particular moment, when much of Pakistan and Nigeria is drowning in floods, the Mississippi and the Hoover Dam are dry as a desert, we find ourselves in a crisis, if I may use the word, of global thought. The air and the water remain at critically harmful level, and so does the ways in which we are approaching how to be together as people arrayed against these challenges. We might say that this, quote, crisis capitalism, to tweak Naomi Klein's disaster capitalism, is shaped by global colonialism, energized by crisis, and that was once identified and diagnosed by W.E.B. Du Bois, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, among others. How then must we reimagine the global? What are the bases of a collective vision that can immure us to the addiction of crisis? I'm eager to hear what my learned colleagues have to say, and I wish you all a warm welcome. Thank you.
So I think Professor Ahmed has set the stage. First, we have to actually think about where we are. Do we agree that, in fact, these are unprecedented crises, or are they actually something that have exacerbated the situation, and therefore it has laid bare what the conditions were? And then what do we do about that? So I want to kind of go back to the earlier phase when the Columbia University Committee on Global Thought was started. And I want you to all think about 2006, where you were, how you thought about it. Some of you joined Committee on Global Thought around that time in the audience. How did you think about the globality as a condition then, and what you could not have imagined would have happened now? Partly, I refer to this because Professor Andreas Wimmer, who was in our class the other day, he was talking about how he was talking about diffusion of ideas in sociological terms. And what he wrote about in 2008, even 2012, would completely be irrelevant today just because of what's going on. So let's try to set the stage of what you thought then and where we are today, and what you could not have imagined how we've got to where we are today. Jean-Marie.
Well, in 2006, I was at the United Nations, charge of peacekeeping. That is a universalist project, which at the time was full of self-confidence. And now it's often characterized as a kind of modern neocolonial enterprise, which it is not completely, but I think the gap between what we discussed today when we discuss peacekeeping and what in good faith we thought of it in the mid-2000s is indicative of the kind of triumphalism that accompanied the end of the Cold War. A sense that now the battle of ideas had been won. Well, that's famous, Fukuyama story, the end of history, and that yes, there could be loose ends to be tied, but essentially there was nothing to think beyond liberal democracy. And I think we confused this temporary victory of a certain Western vision of the world with universalism. And today, I think we see the backlash against that, in the sense that in 2006, we could see ourselves in good faith as citizens of the world, with nothing of those pesky complications of states or anything that intermediate structures. No, we were citizens of the world. And what we see now is that not only are we not citizens of the world, because the world, we don't control it at all, but it's actually scary to think we could be. That we are looking for intermediate structures, little shells in which we could feel more comfortable. So I think between the, yes, a bit arrogant self-confidence of 2006 and the malaise of today, there's a huge gap that we have to fill.
I mean, it seems to me, and I think that, Yasmin, you talk about this a lot, that in those days, there's some notion of cosmopolitanism, and at the same time, the geopolitical and the individual experiences were kind of at some sort of forming a nexus. And today, one can say that because what Jean-Marie is talking about is a much more of a geopolitical reality of this end of history, all of that was about the triumph of neoliberalism, democracy, et cetera. And it was all in geopolitical terms. But in a personal terms, there was the notion of being part of the world that continues to be still a reality in some ways, just because as you talk about having people who are forced migration, that today close to a larger population of the world lives outside of the place where they were born than the United States population. So you have huge numbers of people who are displaced either by force or by desire or by climate crisis or what have you. So how do you think about this notion of the cosmopolitanism, citizens of the world, or the world in which people are not part of one small land?
So let me start by saying that I have nostalgia for cosmopolitanism. And this is something that, I have discussions with my friends and colleagues. I'm looking at some of them who may not.
Can you hear Yasmin?
And let me start by saying that I have nostalgia for the notion of cosmopolitanism as a positive thing, as a positive force. And partly that is the result of my own life history, which is impossible to root in any particular place, especially because I have an extremely complex family history that spans many different countries and many different nations, although my own experience has been largely growing up and living in Italy, and then after a number of years of much going back and forth, living in the United States. So in 2006, what I was thinking about and came back to me with force in those few years was a desire that I had had actually many years earlier, which was to think about people who lived across borders, because my own biography is seared by the impossibilities that legal systems and institutions erect and make it very difficult to live in more than one place at the same time. And the fact that it seemed to me that ordinary people were seeking to live moments of ordinary life crossing borders. So I set off to write a book, which I'm still maybe will never actually finish because I got stuck on chapter 1. But so I set off to write a book that was going to be called How We Live Now. And it was going to be, and so the chapter that I've been stuck on for these many years was on being born and on the issues that arise when you have people being born and being made in different places. And the questions of, so I work on surrogacy, but I've also been interested in questions of assisted reproductive technologies, of things that fragment the normal experience of the canonical experience of birth, and so many of the assumptions that we have. So when I started to think about that, I thought that this ability that people had to go to one place to buy sperm, or to another place to get eggs, and to a third place to have an experience of assisted reproduction, and to a fourth place to engage a woman as a surrogate mother, and so on and so forth. But similarly, to go to a dentist in one place and come back and go and take their pensions and go and live in someplace else. And the numbers really bore out that increasing numbers of people were crossing borders to do these everyday acts, that the assumption that social life is regulated within the confines of the nation state was simply wrong for millions and millions of people. And all these people were experiencing what I called consular nightmares, which was the question that they couldn't get recognition, they couldn't get legal papers to do what they were doing. And so you had babies stuck in borders, you had old people who couldn't get their pensions, you had all sorts of things happening. And that, I thought, required, that simple act of crossing the border required an ability to trust sufficiently in other people, to be able to think of the other place that you went as a place also not just of differentiation and of potential institutional exploitation, which it also is, but also a place that you could be comfortable going. That was my idea of cosmopolitanism. My idea of cosmopolitanism was not you float above, but you're comfortable being able to be in one place and then in another place and then in a third place. I think we've lost that. I think that the concept has become tainted as elitist, that it's associated sort of irremediably with ruthlessness. And I want to bring it back. I'm for being able to rethink community in a different way that's not just nativist, nationalist self-determination. Sorry.
I think, I mean, in a way, it seems to me that that idea of much maligned context that global now seems to be part of, that because oftentimes people for global is out there floating above rather than being in the community. I mean, that in itself, it seems to me, is a big shift. And how do you think about global in that contested space then versus now?
You're asking Mamadou?
Mamadou, yes.
Yeah. I think that I feel that we are trapped by the concepts we are using. Because the moment we began using global, we forgot that before we talked about cosmopolitan, we talked about the universal, we talked about the international, which are covering different territories and trying to account for different problems. And it's quite interesting to try to trace this moment where things are turning, and what we are talking about is literally changing. Because what Yasmin says is relevant to me. In 2006, I was in Michigan at the University of Michigan Ann Arbor. And I was coming from Senegal. I was educated in France. I was born in a city where the African were French citizens since 1880. So, and what does it mean already being born in that space where people were French citizens and fighting for their civil rights, when actually the idea of being an African there was being outside the metropolitan space. And the idea that you are even not thought as a French is interesting. What does it mean when you are in France, which is supposedly to be an open, colorblind society, and saying, okay, I'm French, and people are looking at you and say, what are you saying? And I think it's really, for me, what is interesting is when you ask me, I began thinking about translating the global in the vernacular, and trying to see, which is very different. I think in Africa, the idea of a global is not necessarily the concept around which people are discussing. It's more about the international, but the international is giving them the possibility of acting in the system. The global, they are the victims of the system. They don't exist as such. And this is an issue we have to address. And in particular, in the context of the 2006, 2007, something very important happens. And this is because it's the end of recognizing cosmopolitanism as an important device in the international system. Angela Merkel, Cameron, and Sarkozy, both, the three of them pushed against multiculturalism. Europe turned against multiculturalism. And it's absolutely part of a policy. And it's interesting to see what it meant And what is the global in such a situation is that it's about how it is fought from Europe.
Right.
And we have to pay attention, how do we think about it? And under which circumstances we can do that? And again, what I'm saying, from an African perspective is interesting. You know, in 1915, Du Bois wrote a piece in the Atlantic about World War I. It's amazing. The role of Africa in World War I, the meaning of the war, again, what Manan was saying, a crisis, and how do we get out of it? And how do we get out of it, as he said, is about changing the perception of people and being able to engage in a conversation based on cultures. He's thinking about clustering. So probably if we have a global base on pulling together clusters which are recognized specifically, we will be able to do something.
Well, I mean,
Not staying, in a situation where the global, we like it or not, the global is Western. It's the West.
well, unless we change that perception to embody other details in it.
They are defining the rules. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think, Linda, it seems to me that coming out of the public health side, and I want to move beyond the 2006 now, to really come to the moment now. So as Mamadou talks about World War I and the kind of crisis it created, and I think about World War II and how that crises of the war actually affected the subcontinent, which it was instrumentalized to actually do things that are unthinkable. But in the name of the crisis, what happened? In the public health side of things, as COVID happened, of course, we had SARS before, we have had Ebola before. The systems that we often thought about, I remember when SARS happened in 2004, because I was at the Asia Society and my husband was sitting at Beida, and we're trying to figure out where it was going to go. It seems like the times were different in the way we thought of the public health system then versus now.
I think that's a complicated question. So let me try and, so I'm both a physician, a clinician, and a public health person. And just to make sure that we're talking about using the same definition of public health, because there are many. I'll just say that there are many definitions in many countries where public health is the publicly funded or administered provision of medical care. And when I'm talking about public health, I'm actually not talking about that, just to be clear. So I'm talking about the recognition that it is possible to, based on the science, to prevent disease and disability and injury. And that much of that prevention we now know has to be enacted at a population or community level through both policy and practice, that you don't want to wait till people get sick on many conditions. If in fact prevention is possible, and that it's many of the social and economic and environmental contexts in which we live that are actually the drivers of ill health. And so while a small proportion of prevention needs to be accomplished within medical care, most of it has to be accomplished at a population level. And that goes, I think, squarely into the issues that you're raising about globalization, because implicit in, so I haven't been part of your Committee of Global Thought discussions for all these years, so I'm winging in from left field here. But
we need that.
but no, there it seems to me there are many definitions of globalization or aspirations around globalization as well as around global. And one of the aspirations around globalization was that it could enable a collective mind. Now, that's also, as I understand it, what you're also thinking about around global, that we can get past our borders and solve the problems we have to solve at a collective level. We could finally do it. And certainly from a health point of view, you started out by talking about pandemics, and certainly that's what gets people's attention fastest, is a good pandemic.
So that's when are the crises the one way to move forward, right?
Right.
You know?
But the evidence is that despite that actually globalization has actually enhanced the likelihood of pandemics on the one hand, and we have not yet been able successfully to resolve the anachronistic and sometimes dysfunctional international global architecture we have for preventing or containing them. And they've been variably successful at different points, but we've been through a number of pandemics since 2004, 2003, since SARS. And sometimes they've been successfully contained within a locality or a country or a region, and sometimes they have not. You know, you can think of SARS, HIV, by the way, which began in 1981, MERS, Ebola, et cetera, COVID, and we're going to see an escalation of those. So pandemics are maybe point out, but some of the downsides of globalization, but also I would bet that and I think there's good evidence that they also draw out the recognition that our globalized world isn't working for many populations. You know, just think about thus far still inability to take vaccines developed in the West and get them to the countries around the world. We have not done that, and
despite lots of pronouncements.
Despite lots of pronouncements and likely the capability to do so. And it's to our collective harm, including the harm of the high-income countries that they could have come from. So there's a lot, I mean, just from a public health point of view, perhaps it exemplifies a lot of the complexity. Some problems we can only solve together, but the crises actually are bringing about a recognition of the lack of solutions, enhancing, I think, distrust in the institutions that we had felt vested in 2003,
Right.
that we were optimistic might be able to change and rise to the occasions.
But I think
they
maybe
haven't
there
done
is
it.
something there that Mamadou is talking about, which is that because if globalization is much more Western concept, and therefore the parity that needs to be assumed in the word global doesn't exist. So therefore, any solutions that we think about that needs both the global, national, and the local doesn't ever get done, just
Right.
because fundamentally you still have the parity question.
Right. And then I would add that I think the weight of really problematic things, if not existential crises that have been added since 2006, really amplifies the sense that we cannot, it's driving us apart,
Right.
and cementing, I think, a lot of distrust in each other across countries, and lack of a sense that problems will be solved beyond borders.
Yeah. So all of you, in fact, how do we now think about the current moment and then going forward? So Manan, you articulated very clearly that part of it is that the crises themselves as a term are sometimes manufactured for other kinds of reasons. And what, if anything, as our colleague Roz Morris has often said, that in fact, what these crises point out is the fundamental issues that already were existing, and they're exacerbated rather than they're creating new crises. So if we recognize that global, as we have known it, has not worked for people, now I want to move 10 years out. And just today in our class, we had this young 27-year-old Japanese inventor, AI person, who was talking about not forecasting, but what he calls backcasting, meaning, what do we want? Where can we go? How do we imagine the world in which all of these problems that are transnational are actually beyond borders? How do we actually tackle them? What do we want that world to look like? And or is global, whatever the word we want to use, global, international, cosmopolitan, the terms, do we just give up on that? Can we afford to give up on that? Given the huge amount, especially climate and where we are, pandemics are going to continue to exist in a bigger and bigger way. So how do we think about going 10 years out? What do we want to world to look like or behave like, both in a space and as a concept? And all of you think of concepts in profound ways. So Manan, I'll start with you.
So I think, I guess one of the ways we can think about concepts is that if we examine the concept of solidarity, working together, whether that's at the level of the community or other scales. I think one of the points that I'm interested in thinking through is that the crisis says that to resolve the crisis, we need to come together, right? The language of coming together to solve. But that coming together folds within it, as you're reminding us, and as Mamadou also mentioned, folds within it all of the inequalities that predated the crisis. So the question of solidarity never comes up. We're not actually coming together. And those thinkers who have thought about solidarity have always told us to kind of think about the constellations of power and hierarchies, and who gets to narrate and who gets to act, who is the agent, right? So in the international, there is something called a citizen, and then there's someone who's a non-citizen or a citizen of another nation, and there's some treaty or some aspect. In the global, we have just basically thought about two things. We've thought about global as movement, and we've thought of local as situated. And the solidarities that may be possible between those that are moving and those that are situated, but never across those things. And I think if we think about anti-carceral thinkers who are linking the question of carcerality and the nation states that are invested in it, part of it is that they complicate the question of movement and the question of situatedness. And I think a language of solidarity, a concept of solidarity, does need to be thought through, thought out. I mean, Du Bois in 1915 certainly had given a language of solidarity. Aimé Césaire in 1950, right after the Second World War, Fanon. There's certainly models before us that we need to kind of think about. But until and unless that happens, I mean, today we are almost sure that 3 degrees centigrade rise in global temperature is very, very low on the estimate of what's going to happen. What happens to movements and what happens to solidarity in 10 years from now is going to be determined by that stark reality, as far as I can say.
You're ready to go. Yeah.
Yes, because I I agree that solidarity, the sense that human beings, there is a horizontal link between them, that there is a word, for me, a word that encapsulates that is the word dignity, that is very different from just individual rights. The sense that you exist also in the eyes of other people and that it's part of your identity. I think that's very important. Where I have hesitations is I think, as we think of solidarity, if we just oppose it to globalism, it may be a lost battle, because the way I think we perceive global today is a kind of huge marketplace that crushes us all. And so I think we have to move, and there I think I very much agree with Mamadou, to universalism, and I would add pluralism. That is a sense which is very different from the Western idea that there is one answer, that the flow of history is converging toward one end. That's our version. Yes, I'm a European, I can't help it. But I think there is a
reflexivity.
Yes, and a lot of it happened to me. I mean, the I think I'm beginning to have a sort of self-awareness, and that was part by working for a number of years at the United Nations and looking at Europe from a different perspective, and understanding that Europe in some ways unified the world. It unified it with a sword, with imperialism, with colonialism, also with great ideas. The idea of universalism is in some ways a European idea. So it's a complex story. But for the rest of the world, they cannot just separate this great vision of the unification of the world from what brought it, which was violence, inequality, and crushing the weak with the power of the powerful. And so for me today, and that's why I add the word pluralism, what is important is to recognize that there is a multiplicity of answers to the questions that we ask. And so that's, for me, how you reconcile universalism and pluralism. You do accept that there are values that have a universal dimension, that the safeguard of the individual.
Pluralism is a universal value.
Yes.
That's a word. Right?
Yes, it is a universal value, and also because different societies will have a different balance, for instance, between the individual and the collective.
Right.
And there is no shame in that. But to accept it is a kind of mental revolution, because it goes against the whole grain of, I think, the Western way of seeing things.
One of the things that I often feel is that notion that as if they're oppositional is right there is a problem, is that actually to think of independence and interdependence as part of the same coin, two sides of the same coin, and they both have to exist. So pluralism in terms of ways of thinking, also respecting others, that comes into the universalism, have to coexist. But we don't really know how to do that most of the time. In the Indic tradition, that notion of seeming opposites actually coexist. It's possible. And yet we don't actually encourage that. And so how do we bring that back into this global kind of a space that we're talking about? The other word that I think, Yasmin, you talked about a little bit is that communities. And it's not community that's situated, but communities that is without situational, that's part of the movement of people.
And I would add that we're not a prisoner of one community. We can have multiple shells.
Exactly.
What I would like to say is that I think that there's a risk in our conversations of not acknowledging fully the extent to which all identities are constructed and constituted. And so that when we think about solidarity, or we think about community, or we think of whatever collective term we're thinking about, we also have to think about who and how they've been generated and how do they get to the table and how does that process work. And while I'm all in favor of solidarity and of a more level playing field and so on and so forth. I also think that there's that we have to acknowledge fissures and fragmentation. That it's not just about pluralism, it's actually about spaces where dialogue becomes very difficult. And how do you live with that in a context in which interdependence heightens the stakes of effective dialogue? And I think that's something that, so that we can't imagine a global that is free of discordance. And I think that that was actually a great intuition, and maybe many people will disagree with me, but that it was a great intuition of the UN Charter to really think, to posit a system as insufficient and possibly colonial as it was, that started from the assumption that if you wanted peace, you had to acknowledge war. And you had to try to figure out the rules of its governance. And so that seems to me, unfortunately, to be something that, and look, I'm an old feminist who probably has waved more peace flags than almost anybody around here. But I think one of the strong lessons of these years is to try to understand the fragility of unitary systems and the ways, and in this, I rely on Jean-Marie to help steer us. So discordance, I think we have to think about. I think we have to think about communities that fluctuate, that are not necessarily local or territorially local, but are grounded nonetheless. And we have to be able to respect those kinds of groundings. I think that we need to understand that we do have an institutional system, as fragile as it may be, but that's the institutional system that still contributes to shaping our possibilities of discourse. And so it's not that we live in a world where we can say we have carte blanche.
No.
We are situated in a context, and the question is, how much of that context do we want to transform into living legacy? And how much of it can we change? How much of it determines, in a sort of, how much of our present is going to determine our future?
But I think, there is something about acknowledging that systems exist, but then to abide by that, or do we have to actually change it?
Oh, no, my idea is I have had all the problems that Mamadou has had, birth certificates that are hard to recognize, educational certificates that are not right. You name it, I've had it in dealing with national bureaucracies. I know all about that. And so my idea is, let's find a way that enables people to live from one place to the next, more or less freely. But it goes against every power of the nation state to do that.
So it's undermined the
So
power
I
of the
see
nation
Kian,
state,
I
right?
see Kian
Mamadou,
disagreeing, and Kian and I have a dialogue on this, but
It's striking. Salome was acknowledging the other day that we have deregulated the movement of capital. We have deregulated the movement of goods, but the
people.
movement of people is highly regulated.
correct,
Yeah,
correct.
but the other issue is who deregulated it.
right?
Is also the other problem about the fragment. On one hand, we are saying everything is global. On the other, we do see that things are fragmented. And I think one of the responses to your question, probably we have to get out of the old politics and think differently. Is the whole issue about what Jean-Marie was saying. Senghor was talking about the human condition.
Right,
Mhm.
right,
To think about
right.
the human condition, to think And this is the instability, to think rootedness
Right,
with openness,
right.
Yeah.
to pull them together. In order to do one thing he was interested in, and this is again a good discussion with Jean-Marie, is that Senghor tried to say this negritude people Manan was talking about in the 30s. They say the only way to think about the universal, but even to think about the universal message of the Christian church is to decouple universalism from European culture.
From Christianity.
And the idea of decoupling is the only way to reimagine. And it's again, it's about reimagining. And it's also, Tagore says that in the same years. Tagore say, okay, the phenomenology of everyday life is more interesting.
Right.
And when you see the arc of a philosopher like Husserl, in the early phase, Husserl would say, modernity is exclusively European. And the European, they don't need to be ashamed or to apologize. At the end of his life, when he go into phenomenology, he's saying, okay, probably the only way to think outside the frame is to think the phenomenology of everyday life.
Right.
You discover something else.
Right. I mean, I think that what you're saying is that in order for us to decouple some concepts, we're going to have to bring other knowledge systems into our thinking, because actually the predominance of the Western conceptual thinking is so strong. And yet, I mean, where I come from, one of the things I've always said is that how very much a product of colonial system we are, that we don't even really know our languages well.
Yeah.
We don't even know our own texts well. And then how are you going to recover that? So this idea of openness and situatedness and openness together, there are concepts like that in indigenous tradition, in early Indic traditions that actually can help us understand, but we don't know them. So what we're saying is, and I want to open it up to all of you, is that to reimagine global, we're going to have to go beyond the existing systems of knowledge. And then the words all of you have used, which I think are really interesting, is that none of those words go towards geopolitical. They're going towards horizontal, across, more human-based in a way. And therefore, even though I think Yasmin, as you said, the systems do exist. And so then the question is, what the understanding the limits of the system too. Therefore, you exist in the system, but also understand the limits of the system in order for us to change something.
I would just want to, you have these two books which were published this year.
Right.
You know, and you know, by two colleagues, an old colleague and a young one, they have the same name, Olufemi Taiwo. And the older one wrote a book against decolonization.
Right.
And the other is elite capture. And it's very interesting to read the two books at the same time. I read them and how they are trying to say, okay, all these people who want to decolonize everything are destroying everything. So what do we do? And it's about effectively part of my history is colonial. I like it or not. Is why I claim that French is my language.
Right.
Yeah.
It has nothing to do with the French.
But can I just say something about that? As I said earlier, I'm worried about natural identities, about that we have an implicit operation of them. I'm worried about concepts like authenticity. I'm worried about the idea that you can recapture a true culture in the past. I wouldn't know what to do with myself if somebody were looking for purity.
But it's not
You
about
know, so I
purity.
wanted
It is
to-
creating some alternative systems of
Yeah,
knowledge.
this I
That's
agree with.
different, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But and sometimes you use it strategically. For me, identity
Exactly.
it's strategic.
Totally,
I
totally
can
agree with
I
you.
do it every day. I can be whatever I want.
I know
Yeah,
people always
But
say,
you know that
who
you're
are you?
doing
I
it.
said, it
Yeah,
depends, right? It
Yes.
depends on where I am. I have at least
Yeah.
6 identities, you know, and I
exactly.
use it for what I want to use. With that, we could go on forever, but let me just remind you that this is the beginning of a conversation. There'll be other ways that we're going to be thinking about it, and the floor is open, and we'll take a few questions before we depart. And please identify yourself.
Okay.
And there is a microphone.
Yeah, the mic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Wilson. I'm a resident of New York. 10 blocks from here, so my family are often. I have a question about China. You haven't mentioned the name China. And if there is anybody here that's an expert on China. Number one, do you think there's a future in China for liberal democracy with a growing economy? And number two, do you think the idea of Chinese exceptionalism will lead us into a war in the future with a growing China influence? Thank you.
That's like a whole other program. But anybody would like to take that?
Somebody.
Yeah, Jean-Marie, I can say a word too. This video.
Well, China today is used as a kind of, how would I say, easy opposite
Right.
of what we think we are.
Right.
Of course, I do think that there is in the Chinese tradition, I'm not talking about the present Chinese regime.
Political
There is
regime, yeah.
certainly, in reference to what I was saying earlier, in the balance between the individual and the collective, there's certainly a different vision of that. And the way China may be leveraging new technologies actually to further emphasize the power of the collective over the individual, social credit system and other things like that, gives an idea of where it could go. And so I think the discussion on China is interesting insofar as it forces us to think about ourselves, actually, because it's such an extreme example of an opposite direction that it's worth looking at for that reason. Now, whether it will lead to confrontation, war, and there's great experts at Columbia like Thomas Princeton. I don't claim to have the answer to that. What I see clearly is sometimes I talk about the competitive decline of nations, because I think when you look at China today and what we've seen from the last Congress, it seems that there is a concentration of power that is extremely archaic in the way we should think of power. When we see the situation in this country, in the United States, there are a number of pretty worrying signs. When you see the situation in Russia, other worrying signs. When you see the situation in Western Europe.
In India, I mean, you know.
Yeah. So I think today what strikes me is the gap between the extraordinary dynamism of science, of economy, and the crisis of political institutions worldwide, which cannot catch up, which do not know how to catch up with this fast-changing environment.
It is interesting to remember that when you talk about exceptionalism, it is the very word used to describe America.
Yeah.
And these are two different kinds of exceptionalism, uniqueness of their place. And yet, I think what you're seeing also is that the increased tendency towards authoritarianism is almost in many parts of the country, many parts of the world. So what's that about? You know, so you can't act, I mean, you have to think about China as a one place, but another way to think about China is after 250 years of a Western domination in thought and practice, you now have a non-Western country that is actually attempting to be center stage. That's a different predicament that the world is in, and we don't know what to do with it. And so that's one thing to kind of pay attention. I'm going to take just one or two questions together, and then we'll, one back over there, and then right here, Professor Orlo. Yeah.
Hi. So this is a very interesting conversation. I'm really interested. I mean, I'm learning a lot. I do have a question with regards to like the movement across countries and that concept that was discussed, particularly like how we have liberalized the movement of goods and not people. I really don't know if this is like, how do we feel about that in terms of like the economic inequalities that are in the world, whereby if we do that, wouldn't all possible privileges and good, like especially economic good, be captured by people who have something, as opposed to those who have absolutely nothing being left for nothing? And to explain what I mean, that's, for example, movement in Europe makes more sense because of their economic equality of sorts, and everyone's trying to there to just, there's no capturing that could happen. But imagine if you would open movement from an African country and America, and then you would expect that there would be a lot of inflow from Africa, but lots of people will not be able to afford to do that. But there will be people who will move from here and occupy it, make it more expensive to live there, and just pick up whatever little privilege is there. So I'm just wondering, like, how are we thinking about this in terms of like, without addressing the economic inequality? I also want to ask about decolonization and how you said it is part of our history, and I do agree with that, but I do wonder, is it decolonization that is bad, or how we see it, and how we think of it in a way that it's an event that is going to happen, as opposed to when you got colonized for 100 years, you cannot decolonize in 5 years, or whatever amount of
Wow,
time.
it's
So
two very big questions, and I'm going to take one more question from Ben, and then I have colleagues answer it. Yeah.
So my question, if you can hear me, is the very different meaning of the word movement, not movement of people,
Right.
things, and goods. Thinking of movement, not of
It works.
Okay.
a movement of people, goods, and things. But I was thinking initially of social movements. I realized
Yeah.
but also cultural and political movements. I'm thinking about this partly in relation to the idea of solidarity, which I think can be a very broad kind of engagement across movements. And I think we now hear of movements as often more specific. They're activist around an issue rather than broadly revolutionary, and they form alliances. How does that interact with some of these notions of cosmopolitanism and universalism that I think are very broad and might not have movements? So I think despite the sort of a lot of the limitations that are very narrowing of the period of right-wing turn, fragmentation, retreat to communities, these movements, these new emerging movements, aren't possibly a source of shift. Maybe I don't want to say transformation, but that they are emerging, and in many cases emerging powerfully, might not fit in as much with some of this, some of the concerns here, some of the issues that when we talk about the opposition to carceralism, the rise of reproductive rights come from these movements. So what's going on with these movements? I was feeling good about the movements, so I realized how right-wing most of them are. And how the internet, the new global space was supposed to help us. It's only a source of domination. So in any case,
So I was thinking of movements when Manan first talked about it. I was thinking of those kinds of movements myself, that if they're political, social, cultural movements, what does that do to the space of global? Comments or observations on the last question, and also what our the person back there talked about. So let's take the decolonization, since you talked about it, Mamadou.
Yeah, the decolonization discussion is a discussion which has been open as early as the interwar period. What does it mean in relation to the two concepts, the concept of modernity and the concept of development? And, you know, people have always been confronting each other. If you read Aimé Césaire and his understanding of what is the colonial, as he say, which is a moment where cultures are encountering and the encounter of culture is producing something new. How do you build based on that becomes important? Because at independence, nobody tried to go back to a past before the colonial past. So, but discussion today is in particular related to the concept of the decolonial. And people who are pushing back against the decolonial are saying, okay, can we erase the colonial moment? And erasing it means what? Or can we think about, you have, Mudimbe has written this very well-known book, The Invention of Africa, where he talks about what he called the colonizing structure, which is that, military conquest, incorporation of African economies into metropolitan economy, and what he called the reformation of the colonized mind. And he said that you have a whole library, you have, the colonial library supporting that. And even when we fight against it, we are using the concept developed by that library. And you have historians who are saying, no, the colonial library is a co-production.
So it's a question of agency,
and colonized.
to some extent.
And how it's done becomes an important, what do you do with the knowledge which are produced confronting you, but you also resisting. And it's exactly what Toni Morrison say when she talks about racism. Probably it's not scientific, but racism has been the basis of the production of a culture which is mine. And I have to pay attention to.
And so the movement of people and inequality, one very quick thing, Jean-Marie or Yasmin.
So on the movement and the risk of exploitation, I think that you're absolutely right. There is always a risk of exploitation. I think that what we have to accept, or what I would argue for, is that this is a way that people have found of living now, which is to be able to cross borders, to do a variety of things. And then you have to address the inequalities, the economic inequalities, the inequalities of power. Look, in the work that I've done on surrogacy, for example, and reproductive surrogacy, it's a huge topic, right? It's a topic in all movement that relates to really to biological commerce in one way or another. But it's also a fact of the way we live now. And so how do we regulate that fairly, I think, is really the question, taking into account that it's going to exist.
So with that, I must say that I hope that you have found this a rich conversation, not full answers, but ways of thinking that I hope will get you to think more. And stay tuned, we're going to do other programs. This is an opening salvo into this conversation as we go forward. So please join me in thanking our panelists. Wonderful conversation. And join us for the reception. And those of you who had questions, I know I couldn't take all of them, but while you have reception, you can at least hang out and talk. Thank you.
Thank you.